Welcome everyone. Good evening. How's everyone? Good. Okay, good start. Good start. I want to welcome everybody here tonight so that we can hear some words of wisdom from Rabbi Dr. Natan Slifkin. Rabbi Slifkin, it's a tremendous honor for us to have him with us. It is a great joy for me, particularly to have him with us. I've enjoyed a great deal, not only reading much of what it is that he puts out on his blog, online, but reading his books. He is a fresh, rational, wonderful, I gave it away, didn't I? Wonderful thinker. He is a Talmid Chacham of the first caliber. And I have to say that in a world in where we are looking for truth and we're looking to hear words of Torah and thought in straight and clear fashion, to have somebody like Rabbi Slifkin speaking for us, speaking to us, and teaching us is a tremendous, tremendous value, and we are greatly fortunate to have him. So I'm very, very happy to have him here to share with us some ideas. I'll be in conversation. We're going to be talking back and forth. The social contract for tonight, I bet you didn't know that there is one, but there is one. 90 minutes. So, if anyone has any issue, you can there's a small little exit out the back, you can make your way over there. But otherwise, we're going to do about 90 minutes. What we're going to probably do is do the first hour in discussion, and the remaining 30 minutes will open the floor to questions. We will stay, I think we'll stay, we can stay. You have dinner plans?
Tomorrow, plane flight.
So we will stay. Beyond that, if the questions are going and people want to stay and so on, but that'll be the social contract, so that's okay. Is that all right? Yeah. Good, because if no, you're not going to tell me now, are you? Okay, you're going to put it. Before Rabbi Slifkin starts, I also want to say a personal thank you to him. And that is because recently I was savaged by somebody, a rabbi in Brooklyn online, or at least rabbi in Brooklyn online. And, very, very harsh things were said, so harsh that they really couldn't even believe that they were being said. But nonetheless, you let those kinds of things roll off your back. It's all part of the occupational hazards of being a rabbi who's speaking out in public. And Rabbi Slifkin, with no discussion, no really correspondence, wrote a defense on my behalf. And we had never really formally met before. And so I called him to thank him for that, and I said, why don't you come out to London? And so I'm very happy that he has, and we're looking very forward to hearing your words and your teachings. And please God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give you strength to continue with it very, very much in the future, and hopefully this will be the first of many times. And so I'm going to open the floor to the rabbi. You all have papers probably that you found on your seats that came from Rabbi Slifkin as an outline of what it is that we'll be discussing tonight.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Dweck, for that very kind and generous introduction. It's really very wonderful to be here. My first time here in this magnificent shul. Now, as you may know, about 12 years ago, I got into a little bit of trouble when 3 of my books were declared to be a tiny bit absolutely heretical by 2 or 3 or 3 dozen or so leading rabbinic authorities in the Haredi world. And it was a source of great confusion for many people. What exactly was it in my books that was so terrible? And there was a lot of confusion about it. And actually, what it really was, and this is not well understood, is that I was relying on a certain opinion, perhaps not well known, that Jesus actually did rise from the dead and that he actually was the Messiah. I'm joking.
I was about to get up.
Well, yeah, I normally give a speech in American audiences. When you speak in front of American audiences with a British accent, they think you're completely serious. They're probably like shocked gasps. You knew I was joking. It wasn't that. It was that certain books I wrote in Torah and science, and the 2 primary issues of dispute was, number one, I was writing to accommodate modern science with Torah with regard to the development of the universe and life on Earth. And secondly, that I was putting forth certain views about the science of the Talmud in order to not have to deny what modern science discovers in other areas, in zoology and so on. And the reason why it was particularly confusing that many people were declaring my books to be heretical is that as far as myself and my own rabbanim and my own circles were concerned, not only was everything in my books not heretical, it wasn't even particularly original. Basically, I was just repackaging traditional ideas that had been said by many, many people for a very long time. By Rambam, by Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, by many other people. So how could it be that the same ideas, which were seen by my group to be clearly true and traditional and authentic, and yet those same ideas were to another group of very learned people, were so obviously false and heretical? So it took me a very long time to figure out what exactly was going on. Of course, there was politics involved also. But in terms of the conceptual issues, I eventually discovered is that, we're familiar with different types of Jews, right? You've got Ashkenazim, you've got Sfardim, you've got Litvaks, you've got Hasidim. But there's also another difference which is not well appreciated, but which goes a long way to explaining many ideological disputes in Judaism. And that is the difference between rationalists and... It's very hard to come up with a good label for the other side, but we're going to go with mystics, even though it's not exactly the right label, but close. It's the closest I could find. So, what are the differences between rationalism and mysticism? So they fall into 3 areas. The first is with regard to knowledge. Rationalists believe that knowledge is ideally obtained via figuring things out, and that the human brain really is quite good at figuring things out. Of course, it's not perfect. People are definitely fallible. But the brain is a powerful tool, and certainly the collective enterprise of many different human brains, cross-examining each other, testing each other over a long period, or as we might say, the scientific method is a powerful tool for figuring out truths about the universe. Whereas mystics, on the other hand, are very skeptical about the ability of the human mind, even the collective enterprise of all human minds, to figure anything out. And they much prefer to obtain knowledge via supernatural revelation, which they maintain happens quite a lot. Now, how does that play out with regard to the issue of our book? So let's take the topic of statements in the Gemara about the natural world. So there are various statements in the Gemara about the natural world that do not seem to fit in with what we know from zoology. Chazal, the sages of the Talmud, describe certain creatures that do not seem to exist. For example, they describe salamanders that are spontaneously generated from fire. They describe mice that are spontaneously generated from dirt, not from parent animals. So, in my books, I took the approach of Rambam, Rav Hirsch again, and many others, who say that as great as the sages of the Talmud were in Torah, but when they spoke about these matters, it wasn't based on supernatural revelation, it wasn't based on traditions from Sinai, it was just based on what they'd figured out, what people back then figured out. Right? In the same way as nowadays, let me ask you, is there such a thing as a duck-billed platypus? A furry animal with 4 legs with a beak that lays eggs? Yes? You sure? You've seen one? You haven't seen one. You haven't seen one. Even I haven't seen one. I don't believe you've seen one. Why do we believe it? Because David Attenborough says there's such a thing, right? Who's going to doubt David Attenborough? Right? So back then also, as Rav Hirsch says, Chazal, they accept, Pliny the Elder was he was the David Attenborough of that period, and he described these animals. So it's not Chazal's job to go and investigate, is there really such creatures? They accept whatever the experts of that day had figured out. Whereas in the intervening time, people have been applying their minds more and more to studying the natural world, and now we've figured out that these things do not and could not exist. So it's not a problem to say that Chazal were wrong, because their knowledge wasn't based on any kind of, not even purported to be based on any kind of supernatural tradition. It's just based on what people had figured out, and now we've figured out otherwise. Whereas from the mystical perspective, when the sages made statements about the natural world, it wasn't just based on what they or others had figured out. It was based on supernatural sources of wisdom, Ruach HaKodesh, or traditions from Sinai, and so on. Whereas the scientists who say things, that's just based on what they figured out. And that's not a very reliable source of knowledge. As one of my opponents famously declared at the Agadata convention, he said, these scientists who claim to know what happened millions of years ago. Do they know what the weather's going to be like in 2 weeks' time? No, they don't. Right, so if they can't predict the future, how can we believe them about what they said about the past? I never quite figured out that one, I have to say. Now, so you see, it's a completely different worldview, completely different epistemology, right? In the rationalist approach, it's all based on knowledge that's figured out, whereas in the mystical approach, it's all based on the supernatural revelation. So how on earth could science possibly compete with supernatural revelation? Another example, a related example. A couple of years ago, I was investigating a topic that's coming up soon, right? So Pesach and Seder night, there's a mitzvah to eat matzah. Now, like all mitzvahs, it has to be defined, delineated. If you just taste the matzah, that's not called eating it. So what's the minimum amount that's called eating? So the amount is a kazait. Now, I came up with this radical insight that will shock you. You know, how big is a kazait? So I came up with this idea that perhaps a kazait is about the size of an olive. Shocking, I know. But after all, that is what the word kazait means. And we have archaeological remains of olive pits from Masada, which are the same size as olive pits of today. And we have olive trees that are thousands of years old. So I was interested in, how did this idea arise? That it's not that. One of my kids came in from school with this illustrated guide to how to visualize a kazait of different types of food. Like, a piece of cake would be this big, and popcorn would be this big. And it showed that a kazait of olives is 7 olives. Right? It's just, inherently, raises questions. So I looked into it, and I found something very interesting. Looking at the writings of the Rishonim, the great medieval Torah scholars. So if we look at the Rishonim of Sfard, of Spain, of that area, none of them have any kind of discussion about the size of a kazait. They just don't talk about it. After much digging around, I was able to find some Sephardic Rishonim who mentioned in passing references where it was clear that they believed it to be the size of a regular olive. Right? They spoke about it being a tenth the volume of an egg. But none of them, there's no discussion about it. All the discussion about the size of the kazait is found in the writings of the Rishonim of Ashkenaz. And they're the ones that come out with these large quantities. Now, so why is that? I don't want to be having any kind of anti-Ashkenaz movement here.
It's okay.
But what was the reason? Forget why they come up with a bigger size. Why are the Ashkenazim discussing it and the Sephardim are not discussing it? So what's the obvious explanation? They didn't have any olives in Ashkenaz. So that was the initial hypothesis, and I looked into it and I confirmed it. I checked with historians of food, and they agreed. They said that olives, even in the Mediterranean area where olives grow, nobody ate olives until very recently. The idea of eating an olive, it's a modern phenomenon. In the past, olives were only used for oil. So there would certainly be no reason to export olives to other regions. And in fact, my mother, bless her, she grew up in Wales, and she told me that she never saw an olive until very late in life. And I found that the clincher was, I found the writings of one of the Rishonim from Ashkenaz, and he says that he went to Yerushalayim, and he saw an olive for the first time, and he couldn't believe how small it was. Because, if you don't have an olive, then how are you supposed to know? So I wrote this up in an article, submitted it to a journal, and it was summarily rejected. So why? Because the editor of the journal said he didn't like my implication that when the Rishonim spoke about the size of an olive, it was based on what they figured out. It wasn't based on that. They had supernatural sources of knowledge. Right, so then again, you see, the difference between the rationalist and the mystical perspective. Another example. This is interesting. There's a story in the Gemara which certainly at face value seems to be an absolute rejection of the rationalist approach. And many of my distinguished opponents were citing this story against me at the time of the whole fuss over my books. There's a story about Rabbi Yochanan, and there's a parallel story about Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Yochanan, he made a drasha. He said that when Mashiach comes, right, and Jerusalem is rebuilt, it'll be rebuilt with gemstones and pearls that are 40 feet tall. And the Gemara says that his student says, I don't believe it, there's no such thing. But then the student went sailing out into the ocean, and he saw angels hewing out these gemstones, and I guess diving for these giant pearls, and he said, so now I've seen it, I believe it. And Rabbi Yochanan cursed him because if you hadn't seen it, you wouldn't have believed it. Why wasn't my say-so good enough? And the parallel story in a different Gemara about Rabbi Gamliel speaking about how when Mashiach comes, cakes will grow on trees. So that initially certainly seems to be a condemnation of the rationalist approach. Right? The idea, the message is, take their word for it because they've got supernatural sources of knowledge, and don't rely on what you empirically know from science. But we have to remember that the rationalist approach, it did not begin with Natan Slifkin. It didn't begin with my mentor, Rav Carmel. It's been going back a very long time. And Rambam, of course, Maimonides, the preeminent flag bearer of the rationalist approach, but other Rishonim too. And they also learnt these Gemaras. Right? It's not know about these Gemaras, and they had their own take on it. And their take on it was as follows. That Rabbi Yochanan says that Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt with gemstones, 40 feet, pearls 40 feet tall. And Rabbi Gamliel says that cakes are going to grow on trees. Of course they're not speaking literally, because there's no such thing. Rather, they were speaking metaphorically, they were speaking allegorically. And the problem with the student was that he thought they were speaking literally. And it was only once the student went sailing out onto the sea of knowledge and realized the depths of the metaphors that he realized his error. So that's how, you see again how far apart the worldviews are, that the same story is used by one school as a denunciation of rationalism and another school as a confirmation of rationalism. Now let's move on to another area, which is the laws of nature. Right, we have laws of nature, scientific laws. What are they all about? Are they a good thing? Are they a bad thing? So, the rationalist approach maintains that the laws of nature are one of God's greatest creations. The very laws of science themselves, an orderly system for operating the universe. They are, the Chukei Shemayim, the Aretz, the laws of the universe are the greatest testimony to God's creative wisdom. Whereas the mystical approach maintains that the laws of wisdom are a very unfortunate thing. Now, really, everything should just be supernatural miracles according to God's whims of any second. Why the laws of nature? Because if everything was just supernatural miracles, there would be no room for free will. There'd be no room for free will because it would be impossible to ever deny God's immanence. Therefore, God had to make laws of nature, which give us the possibility of blinding ourselves to God's actions, and that enables us free will. But because the laws of nature are a very unfortunate thing, therefore God will override them. They should be overridden wherever possible. And they can be overridden in lots of circumstances. Right? Whereas the rationalist approach would say no. The laws of nature, that is God's greatest creation. We don't want them to be overridden, because that is the ideal way for God to operate. And this different views of the laws of nature, again, has ramifications past, present, and future. Past, and we'll begin with the ancient past, the development of the universe. I have a confession to make. 20 years ago, I was as anti-evolution as every other yeshiva bacher. Right, what changed my mind? I was reading a sefer Das Chachma Musa by Yechezkel Levenstein from the Mir, and he was writing this idea about how the laws of nature, that is the ideal way for God to operate, and that is his greatest creation. And that's a higher level for God to operate than miracles. So I was thinking, wow, so if that's the ideal way for God to operate, then I guess when it comes to the development of the universe also, it wasn't zap shazam, right? But presumably it was to an orderly system. Right? So that's the idea the rationalist approach would maintain. And when it comes to figuring out how the universe developed, how the universe, the earth, life on earth, right? In the same way as God operates the universe through natural law, he would develop the universe through natural law. And then perhaps if we explore it, we can perhaps figure out the processes which he used to develop the universe and life on earth. Whereas the mystical approach would regard this whole enterprise as preposterous. Why on earth would you look for a scientific explanation for how the universe or how life developed? That's not how God operates. It's completely supernatural, completely beyond any kind of human understanding. And all the sciences dealing with the development of the universe and of life and its consequences, right? The physicists, the astronomers, the geologists, the paleontologists, it's all a mistake because there's no way we could possibly interpret anything about the development of this world. Okay, so completely different worldviews as to whether there's even something to explore here. Then more recently, in biblical times, in the Torah, Rambam says explicitly that when you have an event in the Torah and it's open to interpretation, you could interpret it naturalistically or you could interpret it supernaturally. Rambam says, wherever possible, interpret it naturalistically. We want to see God operating according to the laws of nature, according to his greatest creation. Whereas the mystical approach takes the opposite approach. No, we want to interpret things as supernaturally as possible. And again, there's some examples, coming up to Pesach. So, 10 plagues. So a few years ago, so let's talk about the second plague, right? What's the second plague? Frogs, right? And what does the pasuk say? It says, Batal hatzfardea, and the frog came up. It doesn't say hatzfardein, it says hatzfardea in the singular. Why does it say it in the singular? Anyone tell me?
For the group. Herd of frogs.
Okay, I want to know the wrong answer first, and then we can get to the right answer. Yeah, thank you very much. Right, there was one frog, right? There was one frog, and the Egyptians hit it, and then it miraculously split up into billions of frogs, right? And what's the source of that explanation? Where do we know that explanation from? Midrash quoted by Rashi, right? Does Rashi say anything else? Yes, he does. He does indeed. Rashi says that is the drush, right? The exegetical explanation, but the pshat, the straightforward explanation, Rashi says, as you said, which is that when you have a swarm of something, it's referred to in the singular. Right? It's somewhat similar to how in English we say the frog plague, we don't say the frogs plague. Right? It's a whole swarm together, so it's referred to in the singular. Now, why is it that since, I give this lecture many places across the world, and I always ask this question, and there's always people who know, yes, it was one frog that split into millions of frogs, and that's what Rashi says, and almost never does anyone recall the pshat that Rashi gives. Why? Because it's not very exciting, right? It's much more exciting to think of a magic frog that splits into billions of frogs. But again, there are two different ways of looking at it, or naturalistically or supernaturally. The plague of Orov. What was Orov? Wild beasts, like, for example, lions, hyenas, lions, tigers, bears, right? Now, a couple of years ago, I saw this very beautiful illustrated Haggadah that had pictures for the 10 plagues, and for Orov, it showed you lions and tigers and bears, and it showed a giant octopus coming out of the ocean and breaking into the houses and putting, and unlocking the doors from the inside so the other animals get in. Based on certain midrashim that you can find, and it showed a polar bear arriving in a block of ice. So again, based on certain midrashic insights that people have had, and what's the idea? Again, to make it as supernatural as possible. Lions and tigers and bears, okay, boring, we saw it in the Wizard of Oz. I want to have something more exciting. So we'll have giant octopuses breaking into houses and polar bears on ice. Whereas, if you look at the Gemara and the Midrashim, the original, what Chazal say about it, so you find different views. There's a view that it was wild animals, unspecified. There's a view that it was just wolves. Just wolves, that's it. Not very exciting. There's another view that it was flies. Because the word Orov itself just means, a horde, a swarm. It doesn't not telling you what species it is. So there's a view of Chazal that it was just flies. Now, why doesn't that view get any publicity? Because it doesn't make for such a nice, illustrated Haggadah. Barad, hail. Anything special about it? Fire, right? Fire burning inside the ice. Right, amazing. What's the source for that? Nope. Yeah? Right, it seems to be the pasuk. It's the pasuk itself. It's the Torah itself, right? It says, "Ve'esh mitlakachat b'toch habarad." There was fire burning inside the hail. Right, this isn't, some recent midrash that we can. It seems to be the pasuk itself, or is it? Now, what's a barad? Is barad a hailstone or a hailstorm? Now, what was tzfardea? Was tzfardea a frog or all the frogs? All the frogs, according to Peshat. So what's barad? It's not the hailstone, it's the hailstorm. It's all the hailstones. So if barad is all the hailstones, then when it says that the fire is flashing inside the barad, it doesn't necessarily mean fire flashing inside every individual hailstone. Rather, it means fire flashing amongst the hailstorm as a whole, which would refer to what? Lightning, exactly. So, Soloveitchik in Emotions of Ethical Man, he discusses this, and he points out, you look at the 10 plagues, I'm paraphrasing here, it's not as though it's the most supernatural things you could imagine, right? It's not a plague of dragons and a plague of bowlogs, right? It's locusts, it's pestilence, things that we're familiar with, and even the things that don't seem to be naturalistic can be reinterpreted that way without too much difficulty. Right? So he says, what's the idea? He says a miracle is not the idea of something totally supernatural. God intervening into the laws of nature that he created, but rather it's something within nature, and the miraculous aspect is the timing of it, that it's synchronized with the fate of the Jewish people. And that shows you that really nature itself was programmed by God. A different perspective of miracles, perhaps, than we're usually used to hearing. Kriyat Yamsuf, right? So the pasuk says that the wind blew all night. What do you mean? It didn't show that in the movie. Right? So the Rishonim explained that it was through a naturalistic process. Why? Because God Himself created the laws of nature. So why should He be overriding them? The rationalist Rishonim viewed miracles as like a patch from Microsoft. Right? If you're running, Windows, Microsoft Windows on your PC, so every so often, there's an automatic update from Microsoft. You might think, wow, that's so cool. Apple doesn't have that. But if you know more about computers, you realize, yeah, well, that's because Apple made a really good operating system in the first place that does what it needs to do, right? Windows is a mess, so Microsoft constantly has to intervene to make it do what needs to be done. So that's how the rationalists Rishonim viewed miracles. It means that nature isn't doing what's needed, so God has to intervene, not an ideal way for things to operate. So they prefer to see things running according to nature, not according to miracle. Not just in biblical times, in the present. Right, so there's people who get inspired and like to tell stories about supernatural miracles, and rabbis who work supernatural miracles. I'm sure you do. Right? Whereas there's other people who are somewhat skeptical about those stories, and they prefer to hear about greatness in people's humanity, not in their superhumanity. And then when it comes to the future, so we have the nevuos, the prophecies about the Messianic era, such as the famous one where it says that the lion will lie down with the lamb? No. Not in my Bible. That's a common myth. Maybe that's the New Testament. I don't know. No, it's the lion with the cow. The lion with the cow and the wolf with the goat. Lion with the cow and the wolf with the goat. So, back in Israel, I have a museum, the Biblical Museum of Natural History, where, it explains all the animals from the Torah, a combination of taxidermy, stuffed animals, and live exhibits. So it occurred to me recently, I could do this great live exhibit of the Messianic era of a wolf with a goat. And one of my staff said to me, but how are we going to pull that off? I said, very simple. Every day, a new goat. Right? So, you have these prophecies, and so Rambam says it's not literal. Right? Rambam says it doesn't mean that miraculously, supernaturally, these predatory animals will change their nature, not just what they like to eat, but even their physiology, that a lion would be able to digest vegetation. But rather it's a metaphor. Why? That throughout Tanakh we see the idea that animals are used as a metaphor for evil nations. Right? Discuss this in my encyclopedia. Quick plug, you can see examples in my Torah encyclopedia of the animal kingdom over there. The lion represents Babylon, and the bear represents Persia, and the leopard represents Greece. Animals representing nations, and the idea that they're going to lie down with their prey is that in the Messianic era there'll be world peace, that nations will cease to be at war with each other. That's how Rambam views this. Whereas Ramban says, no, it's literal, it means what it says. It means that in Messianic era, lions, wolves, they are going to change their nature. They're going to cease to be predatory. They're going to be able to subsist in vegetation. It's going to be a totally supernatural change of their nature. So we see that whether it's talking about the development of the universe, biblical times, contemporary times, the future, completely different worldviews as to whether the ideal is for God to work according to natural law, or whether the ideal is for God to work according to miracles. So that's the first two aspects of the difference between rationalism and mysticism, and we'll now move over to Rabbi Dweck for his comments before continuing with the next one.
All right. Thank you for that. You sure don't want to spend some more time here in London? You could use it. I'm usually on Rabbi Slifkin's side on all of these things, and I still am, of course, but and it wasn't meant to be a debate. And I'm sure that what I'm going to say is not contrary to what Rabbi Slifkin is saying, unless it is, and then you'll tell me and get more interesting. But there are two things that I would raise, because what Rabbi Slifkin is talking about is a question of what is. How are things? Are they as the mystics see them, in where they are not tested, and nor do they need to be tested, because who needs to test God? And the less you test God, the better. That means the more you believe, and the more you believe, the better. Or is it in terms of the rationalist idea, in where we live in a world where astonishingly, we can understand the world, at least to a certain degree. And that the fact that God created a world and us in it, that we could understand, is meaningful, rather than it being an elaborate diversion that we have to force ourselves not to recognize as being real. But there are other elements to this that oftentimes get lost in the debate. There isn't usually a debate, there's usually screaming matches back and forth. But when there is a debate, the baby often gets thrown out with the bathwater. Because there is a question with regards to rationality and reason. And that is, are there any limits to it? Are there limits to reason? Are there limits to rational thought? And I think all of us, if we were honest, would say, well, of course there is. There's only so much that reason can do for us. There are things that reason cannot explain, like love and beauty and God. And no matter how much we use our reason to talk about those things, the only reason we use the reason in order to be able to talk about it is in order to be able to open ourselves to be able to experience it. And because we are so concerned about mystical approaches, we don't trust experience anymore. And they ruined it for us. Because when we talk about things in such fictitious ways, we lose all capacity to be able to experience on a human level. And so when we do experience beauty, and we know that you cannot write a book, not 10, not 20, not 100 books, to explain beauty to someone, and that the only way they will ever be able to know it is to experience it, that you could do the same for love, that the best gloss for a poem is another poem, that the best expression or interpretation of a symphony is another symphony. It is the only way that we really could ever absorb and maintain such elements of our world without reducing them almost to the absurd. And so that's a question. People think, the Rambam, I barely speak without mentioning the Rambam. And people often think that the Rambam was this massive rationalist, which he was. He was like uber rational, the Rambam. But they think that as a result of that, his personality was sterile. And nothing could be further from the truth. But we don't always see that come across in his Mishneh Torah and his Moreh Nebuchim. You know where we see his personality come across? In his letters. Rav Shelat, he printed 2 volumes full of the Rambam's letters. And when you read his letters, you read of his love and his compassion and of his humanity and of his bravery and of his honor and of the fact that he risked his life simply to be able to give hope and strength to people who are being persecuted in other parts of the world, knowing that it could be read in transit, his letters that he was writing to them. You read these little excerpts of a description of a person who came to visit him and how he served them lemon cakes and how he played with the children. Nobody knows that Rambam. But you see the Rambam come out when he writes about love in the 10th perek of Hilchot Teshuvah. And he says, you know the love I'm talking about, when you can't think about anything else, when you can't eat, when you can't sleep, when you can't do anything but think about this woman that you're in love with. That's how you should love God. So what does he do there? He doesn't write rational explanations. He just says, you know it. If you've seen it, if you've experienced it, you know it. If you don't experience it, then how am I supposed to explain it to you? That's the way that you're supposed to love God. So that's one point that I think it's very important for us to be able to recognize and understand. Reason acts as scaffolding and kindling for our soul. And what happens when all we use is reason, and the only thing that we accept is what we can measure and taste and touch and feel, is we lock ourselves out of entire worlds of reality as a result of it. And because we are living in a post-mystic world, in the sense that in religion we were abused with mystical thought, and where the more I believed, in the Mark Twain's terms, believed in what I know ain't so, the more I was abused that way, the more I was taught that I cannot rely on my experiences. And so we reduce ourselves down to nothing more than the constituent parts, and we convince ourselves that the sum is nothing more than its parts. And that's a serious problem. And so we are not only experiencing, and I'd be very interested to hear in what the rabbi has to say about this, but we're not only experiencing this terrible problem with the rejection of rational thought on one side, we're also dealing with a tremendous rejection of experiential, emergent, holistic experiences of life that are reduced to the absurd on the other side. And we somehow need to find our way in the middle. Because in my understanding of Torah, that's where Torah lives. And so there's this issue that I think is very important for us to be able to think about and understand and question how it is that we maintain it and bring it into our rhetoric and our dialogue, and how it is that we can begin to write about it and speak about it and feel whole and confident in it without fearing that we will fall into the occult, cultish insanities of the mystical approach to Judaism. I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. You're a much more poetic speaker than I am, that's for sure.
Stick around.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to address some of the things you said, but I just want to stick to the order in which I prepared it, so I'm going to swing around to those points at the end. Mm-hmm. First, I want to deal with the order and the source sheets, which is going to another area of the difference between rationalism and mysticism, and that is with regard to Mitzvot, with regard to the service of God. What's it all about? What's the point of Mitzvot in general? So the rationalist approach, and Rambam says this explicitly, is that all Mitzvot serve one or more of three possible goals. They teach us ideas, they improve our characters, or they help perfect society. That is what all mitzvot do. Now, it could be there's some mitzvot which is easier to figure out how they do that, like the mitzvah to honor your parents. And there's some mitzvot where it's more difficult to figure out how they do that, like paraduma. But that is what all mitzvot do. Teaching us ideas, improving our characters, or perfecting society. The mystical approach, on the other hand, agrees that yes, mitzvot do those three functions. However, it sees that as being a relatively minor aspect of mitzvot. The primary aspect of mitzvot is to manipulate various supernatural forces. And in general, whereas the rationalist approach minimizes the number of supernatural forces, the mystical approach likes to maximize the number of spiritual forces and entities that exist. And the mitzvot are there to manipulate those forces. Let me give some examples. Mezuzah, right? So every Jewish home has a mezuzah. Why? What does it do? What does it accomplish? What's the function of a mezuzah? Anyone?
To remember Pesach.
Yeah, but I want to hear the wrong answer first, so then we can get to the right answer. Could someone be so helpful as to say the popular wrong answer? Or not, I'll say wrong, different answer. Security system, thank you. Protection, yes. Actually, no, I should call it the wrong answer, because I'll get to that later. Yeah, different, one answer. Right? The mystical approach is that mezuzah serves as a protection for your home. Creates a metaphysical force field around your home. Whereas the rationalist approach maintains, as you very unhelpfully pointed out right away, that mezuzah serves as a reminder. Right? You look at the mezuzah and you think about what's written in it, it reminds you to be a good Jew. Right? And there's a very interesting ramification of this difference, which is, that if you, God forbid, have an accident at home, a house fire, a burglary, something like that, so according to the mystical approach, what do? Checking mezuzahs. Right? Whereas according to the rationalist approach, why on earth would he checking mezuzahs? What's mezuzahs got to do with anything? That's not what mezuzahs are there for. Rambam says explicitly in a very strong language, mezuzahs are not there to protect your home, they're there to teach us ideas. A couple of weeks ago, one of my children came up to me and she said, Abba, is there something written in the mezuzah about right legs? I'm like, no. Are you sure there's nothing about right legs in the mezuzah? Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Why? She said, well, I hurt my right leg, a few times, so I figured it must be that there's something in our mezuzahs about that, which is where it's not written properly, and that's why my right leg is hurting. Oh my goodness, I have failed as a rationalist parent. Another example, Natilat Yadayim, mitzvah to wash your hands in the morning. What's that about? Cleanliness, physical hygiene. Okay. Any other possibilities?
To wash away the demons of the night.
To wash away the demons of the night.
I know
Right.
it's not true.
I didn't say it's not true. Yeah. Right, wash away the demons of the night. Right, harmful metaphysical forces that descend during the night. Right. There's another explanation too. What's the very first explanation given in the Rishonim for Netilat Yadayim? Anyone know? The very first explanation given is that it's to put yourself in the frame of mind like the Kohen in the Bet Midrash. Right, the Kohen in the Bet Midrash, before starting his service, he would wash his hands. So we want to put ourselves in the frame of mind that we're starting our day of serving God. Right, so we have three explanations of the mitzvah, one of which is mystical, right, getting rid of harmful metaphysical forces, and two of which are rationalist, either physical hygiene or psychological, putting yourself in the frame of mind for serving God. Right, different views on it. And it's interesting, Rabbi Yosef Cairo and the Bet Yosef, he discusses some of the intricacies of how you do it, how you pour exactly, and he says explicitly that some of these intricacies are only based on mystical explanations of the mitzvah, which he says are not the explanations that you find in the earliest sources. Another example, this is one of my personal favorites, Shiluach Hakan. Shiluach Hakan. So when you come across a nest of birds, so a mother bird sitting on the eggs, and so there's a mitzvah, in fact two mitzvah. First there's a prohibition, you're not allowed to take both the mother bird and the eggs, you're not allowed to do that. And then there's the positive commandment that you're allowed to take just the eggs, but before doing so, there's a mitzvah you have to send away the mother bird first. Now, what are those mitzvahs all about? So, amongst the Rishonim, with virtually all the Rishonim explain Shiluach Hakan in terms of compassion. The prohibition against taking both mother and eggs is because it's cruel to destroy 2 generations of animal life, or because why she's sticking around in the first place, because she wants to protect her eggs. So to take advantage of her maternal instincts to be able to catch her and kill her, that would be really heartless. Right? So it's about compassion. That's why you can't take both. And the reason why there's a mitzvah to send away the mother before taking the eggs is because when the mother bird, when she sees you taking the eggs, it's extremely distressing for her. She's not thrilled about being sent away either, but at least that way, when she comes back and the eggs are gone, she's not upset at having seen it happen. And you might think, well, what do you mean? Either way, she knows that she's lost her egg. So the answer is birds are not very intelligent, right? There's a reason why we have the phrase bird brain, because in general, birds are not very intelligent. Except for parrots, of course. Parrots are the exception. In fact, we have a parrot back at the Biblical Museum of Natural History who's very, very intelligent. He talks a lot, and we have him because he's very beautiful. In the Gemara it says, "There's a bracha that you make in beautiful creatures." Baruch shekacha lo ba'ilamo. Blessed is the one who has such things in the world. So he's very beautiful, and we have him as an example of that. In fact, he's learned to make the bracha himself. He actually started making the bracha himself. Guess he must be making it on me. The parrots are very intelligent. Of course, there's a story of the Hasidic guy who goes into a pub. A chassid goes into a pub, he's wearing the full gear, right, the shtreimel, the kapata, everything. Just very unusually, he has this beautiful parrot at his shoulder, this beautiful parrot you've ever seen. And the bartender says, "Wow, where did you get that?" And the parrot goes, "Stamford Hill." No, but seriously, folks, no. So, except for parrots, birds are not very intelligent. And so it's true, and this is confirmed by ornithological studies. When the bird sees you taking the eggs, it gets very upset. But if it's sent away and it comes back and the eggs are not there, it will just lay new eggs. It's not so upset by it. Right, so that's how virtually all the Rishonim explain the mitzvah of Shiluach Hakan, that it's about compassion. The Zohar, on the other hand, has a completely different explanation of the mitzvah. According to the Zohar, Shiluach Hakan has absolutely nothing to do with compassion. The point of the mitzvah, says the Zohar, is that when you send the mother bird away, she is upset. She's distressed because she's being sent away from her nest, so she is chirping in distress. As a result of that, up in the celestial realms, the angel who's appointed over the birds, he gets upset. And that angel goes to God and complains to God about the pain that this bird is enduring. At which point God says, "Why are you complaining about the pain of the bird? What about the pain of the Shekhinah? What about the pain of the Jewish people in exile? Why is nobody complaining about that pain?" And as a result of that, God decides to have an outpouring of compassion on the Jewish people. Right, so according to the Zohar, the Shiluach Hakan has nothing to do with being kind to the bird. On the contrary, it's about being cruel to the bird. Not for the sake of cruelty itself, but in order to engineer this whole metaphysical process. That the angel of the birds will be upset, and he'll go and complain to God, and God will say, "Why are you complaining about the bird, not about the Jewish people?" And so on. So, conceptually, poles apart, completely different views of the mitzvah. and a very interesting practical ramification, at least nowadays, which is as follows. Today, we're not used to collecting our eggs from nests, right? Eggs are manufactured in the supermarket, right? So nowadays, if you come across a nest of eggs, nobody would actually want to take the eggs. I mean, I would, of course, to add to the egg collection, but normal people, right? Normal people would not want to take the eggs. It's not like in the past when food wasn't as plentiful. Nowadays, food is plentiful, thank God. You buy your eggs at the supermarket, you don't collect your food from the wild. So nowadays, when nobody actually wants the eggs, is there a mitzvah to send away the mother bird or not? So according to the rationalist approach, of course not. The whole mitzvah is that if you want the eggs, which historically speaking tended to be the case, this is the most compassionate way to go about doing it. But if you don't want the eggs, you don't do anything. Whereas according to the mystical approach, it doesn't make a difference if you want the eggs or not. The whole point is to send away the mother bird so that she's upset, so that the angel of the birds is upset, and so on and so forth. Right, so based on the mystical approach, somebody sent me a flyer from Brooklyn advertising that for just $600, you too can fulfill the mitzvah of Shiluach Hakan. And there's people making a living, staking out birds' nests and taking people to do the mitzvah. And then someone else wrote to me about how in Stern College there was a girl who had a bird's nest on her windowsill, and the kindness of her heart, she opened up her room for other people, and then all day long there were people coming in, girls coming in, sending away the mother bird, comes back, send it away, comes back, right? Which according to the mystical approach is the idea of the mitzvah, but according to the rationalist approach, no. And in fact, the Torah Tamima, Rabbi Levy Epstein, he speaks about it very harshly, saying that it's completely the opposite of what he believes the mitzvah to be about. So there's another example where you see how far apart these worlds are. Another example. This is very interesting. A couple of years ago, my wife was sitting Shiva, and somebody gave her a book called The Neshama Should Have an Aliyah. Right, I know it's interesting, in England, when you're paying condolences to somebody, you say, may you have a long life. That's what I remember from England. Whereas in America and Israel, it's more than you say, the greeting people say is the neshama should have an aliyah. Right? The soul should receive an elevation. And this book was all about what can you do? What can you do for someone who's passed away? What nice thing can you do for them? And it gave like a list of priorities. Right? It said the very best thing you can do for them is to learn Torah. Learn Torah dedicated to the elevation of their soul. And learn it to the highest level possible. Right? For the best elevation. But the book says, not everybody is capable of learning Torah to such a high level. So what you can do is you can pay other people to do it, to learn at a very high level on behalf of your parent, your ancestor. That's the best thing to do. And then it moves to the second best thing you can do for someone who's passed away, and that's to give tzedakah, to give charity. And there too, there's different levels. What's the best level of charity, it said? To support and pay people who are learning Torah. So I began to see a certain theme emerging here. And I looked at who published the book, and lo and behold, it was published by a kollel that raises funds, to fund people to learn in memory of a loved one. So, my spidey sense started tingling, and I decided to look into it very carefully and look at the sources, and I found something very interesting. Until extremely recently, 150 years ago, there was never any discussion of the possibility that you can pay somebody to learn Torah or to do mitzvahs, on behalf and credit your ancestor. There's an idea that you can honor anybody's memory, in this world, build a monument, whatever you want. But in terms of being a zechut, a merit for somebody, the only people who can be a merit for people are those who are the consequences of those people. Right? You are the consequence of your parents, your teachers, right? So anything good that you do is a credit to them. It's a zechut to them. But nobody else can be a credit to them, somebody who's completely not connected to them. And when this question was first raised in Halachic sources, the response on it, they say, no, there's just no mechanism. How is a complete stranger going to have the mitzvah for their reward transferred to your ancestor? There's just no mechanism by which it happens. The reward of the mitzvah is the relationship you build with the God. You can't wire it to someone else's bank account. Whereas according to certain mystical approaches, yes, you can. Right? The reward for mitzvahs is certain, packages of spiritual energy, that can be transferred to other bank accounts. And we're not just talking about in the next world, in this world too. A couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine in New York forwarded me an email that somebody in the community was unfortunately very unwell. And there was an appeal to pray for the person, right, of course, but also to do mitzvahs to benefit that person. My friend asked me, is there any basis to this? And I said, as far as I know, there isn't. And he asked certain rabbis in the community, didn't reply to him, but he asked a certain Rosh Yeshiva at YU who said, Who said, no, there isn't. There's no classical basis of the idea that you can do mitzvahs and then benefit, and dedicate the reward of that mitzvah to a completely different person. There's just no mechanism for it. And this leads us, and so that, again, another area seeing difference between rationalist and mystical views. And one final mitzvah I want to discuss, and this is one of the most interesting ones, that is the mitzvah of learning Torah. What is the mitzvah of learning Torah all about? So according to the rationalist approach, it's the same as all the other. It's the same as all the other mitzvot, which is that learning Torah, again, the three goals. It teaches you ideas. You learn about Judaism, you learn about Torah. It improves your character, and it tells you how to improve society. That is what the mitzvah of learning Torah does. According to the mystical approach, on the other hand, most prominently expressed in the in Nefesh HaChaim by Rav Chaim of Volozhin, yes, learning Torah does all that, but that's a relatively minor aspect of what learning Torah is about. The primary function of learning Torah is to, again, hard to put it in simple English words, but basically creating positive spiritual energy in the world, right? Empowering the metaphysical worlds. Now, there's a very interesting consequence of this different, you might think, well, it's all academic. No, there is an interesting difference here, practical ramification, which is as follows. Everyone agrees that every Jew needs to have a good working knowledge of Torah so that you know how to be a good Jew. And everyone agrees that some people have got to have an even more advanced knowledge so that they'll know how to teach Torah, how to issue rulings, how to be rabbis, dayanim, and so on. But let's say somebody already has enough Torah knowledge to know how to function as a good Jew, and that person, for whatever reason, is not going to become a teacher, a rabbi, a judge, anything like that. So if that person continues to learn Torah, he benefits from it, but does society benefit from it? No. So according to the rationalist approach, no. How would society benefit from it? Whereas according to the mystical approach, absolutely. Because he is bringing positive spiritual energy into the world. Right? And you see this playing out very strongly in Israel. So, for example, Rav Eliezer Melamed, who's a very prominent authority in the Dati Leumi community and the author of a very fantastic series of books called Panini Halacha. So he says, society has to everyone has a responsibility to ensure that everyone has a basic level of Torah education, and also to support the training of people to be Torah teachers. But once people have reached, they've learned in yeshiva, they have an adequate basis to live as a Torah Jew, and if they're not going to be teachers, then society cannot fund them. On the contrary, they have to then go out into the world and help build up society. Whereas, of course, others say no, society should fund people in Kollel because that is bringing positive spiritual energy into the world. So you begin to see some of the sociological ramifications of the difference in the worldviews. Now, I'm going to tell you something that may shock you. I personally am inclined towards the rationalist approach. I know you weren't expecting that. Now, I'm personally obviously inclined towards the rationalist approach. However, I'm just going to finish off here. However, I am not on a mission to eradicate mystical Judaism. I'm not. There may be some mystics who are out to eradicate rationalist Judaism. There are some rationalists who are out to eradicate mystical Judaism, but I am not. Why? For a few reasons. Firstly, the rationalist approach has its own problems. It's not all worked out. It raises a lot of questions that certainly do not have easy answers. Secondly, and more importantly, as Rabbi Dweck mentioned, the mystical approach has certainly gotten much, much more popular over the years. Why is that? So I think because frankly, for many people, perhaps even for most people, the mystical approach provides for a much better Judaism. One that's more inspirational, one that's more motivating. The rationalist approach, God is kind of detached, and it's a very more cerebral kind of approach, whereas in the mystical approach, things are much more dynamic. You've got all these spiritual, supernatural forces that are interacting with you and that you're manipulating with mitzvot. And there's many ways in which it's much more comforting, whether it's something trivial, like, you missed the bus. So according to the mystical approach, it's because, various supernatural forces of providence made that happen. Whereas according to the rationalist approach, it's because you didn't get out of bed early enough. All right, so wouldn't you much rather have the mystical approach? But even, more serious things, tragedies and so on, I see it. The mystical approach is much, much better at helping people cope with suffering. And the Jewish people have certainly known their share of suffering over history, and I think that's why the mystical approach has become much more popular. And it's not black and white, again, referring back to what Rabbi Dweck said. It's not as though you're either a rationalist or a mystic. There may be some people who are solely in one category or the other, but by and large, we're talking about a spectrum. We're talking about two poles of thought. Some people are inclined more towards one, some people are inclined more towards the other. But it's really a case of different strokes for different folks. One man's meat is another man's poison. For some people, the rationalist approach, is a breath of fresh air. It makes things much more reasonable. Doesn't make impossible demands of them intellectually, and it's very motivating for them. Whereas for other people, the rationalist approach is dry and sterile and boring and not motivational, and they prefer the mystical approach. Right, so it's really a case of different strokes for different folks. And what I think is really beautiful about Judaism is that the reason why the rationalist approach and the mystical approach are not two religions is because as a religion, Judaism is not like other religions. We're much more focused on what you do rather than what you think. The majority of the differences we've been speaking about fall into the conceptual realm. But being a good Jew is traditionally had very little to do with what you think. It's much more about how you act, doing the mitzvot, being a loyal member of the community. It's always been much more about that. And the rationalist-mystical divide doesn't have many ramifications in that area. It's interesting, back home in Ramat Beit Shemesh, I daven in a tiny little shul, only about 15 people in the shul, and about half of us are diehard rationalists and half of us are diehard mystics. And we get along just fine, because the davening's the same. Of course, if somebody opens their mouth to give a Dvar Torah, that's when the sparks start flying, but as long as everyone keeps their mouth shut, we're able to get along okay. So my goal is not, in my writings and so on, is not to eradicate the mystical approach. Rather, it's to give a voice to, and preserve the rationalist approach, which is in danger of going extinct. The rationalist approach has been on the decline so much that nowadays there are many people, even supposedly very, very learned people, who don't know that it ever existed, or don't understand the extent to which it applied and the rich heritage that it has. And so they're basically going extinct. So I'm very passionate about saving things from extinction. Yesterday, I was in a Birds of Prey centre near Manchester, and I was holding this beautiful bald eagle. And this is something which in the United States, it's at the risk of extinction. The bald eagle, the spotted owl, the California condor, they're going to go extinct. And it's a shame. Everyone knows it's a shame. It would be a shame if rationalist Judaism goes extinct too. And before I hand over to Rabbi Dweck for his comments, I'll just leave you with a story of the case I read about of the person who was convicted of shooting and killing and eating a bald eagle. And in his defense, when he was brought to court, in his defense, he said he's never been hunting before, first time he's done any such thing, didn't realize what he was doing, or it was illegal, any of that. So he was let off. But as he was leaving the courtroom, the judge said to him, "I'm just curious, what does bald eagle taste like?" So he said, "Well, it's kind of like a cross between spotted owl and California condor."
That's good. Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you. We're going to turn it over to questions in a moment, but I will make just a few comments before we do. It's interesting. I think that what I'm surprised at is I actually think that you're a little bit more pluralistic than I am. I don't cut so much slack to the mystical approach, at least in the way that we've defined it tonight. It's flawed. I'm going to say that Rabbi Slifkin shouldn't say that because you travel. I don't travel as much. But it's flawed. And the flaw in the way that we've described it tonight is that what it aims to do is to take abstractions and make them concrete without care or concern about the necessary steps to do so. So what you quoted with regards to the Zohar and the Shiluach Hakan, the Zohar is a perfectly reasonable Zohar when you're understanding it in a conceptual fashion, right? If I had to look at a mitzvah and think of it in conceptual terms and what implications I might take from it, well, there's nothing wrong with that. There's much crazier presentations of mitzvah in the Talmud than that. I mean, insane implications in the Talmud. And there are stories in the Talmud where rabbis sit down and study Torah and fire starts surrounding their head and birds get burned and so on and so forth. And all of this is understood in abstract terms, in bringing forth poetic expressions of sophisticated ideas, because to speak about it in prose is not sufficient to maintain its full complexity. That's fine when we understand that. When I read the Zohar, however, and decide that because this is what it says in the Zohar, I'm going to do X as a result of it and bring it straight down into practical action, without thinking about the fact that these abstractions need to develop appropriately and that I'm going to lose a huge amount by bringing it down into the concrete, is when we get the problems. And these problems are problems. They are major problems. And I don't accept, and I'm not saying that, I'm not arguing with the rabbi, I'm saying my opinion. I don't accept that this is a healthy part of Judaism. And I think that it's something that causes a tremendous amount of closed-mindedness, of parochial thought, of abuse, of violence. You know, as Einstein said, great thinkers have experienced violence at the result of mediocre minds. And this happens because when one cannot accommodate the complexities and sophistry of thought, they attack it. And when the scaffolding that they create for themselves in mystical terms that cannot be falsified are what they use to be able to protect themselves, anytime that you poke a hole in that, they'll go for the jugular. And that's not okay. It's not okay, and it's not part of the Torah. So I'm saying that on my own volition, has nothing to do with my views do not represent Rabbi Slifkin. That's one point. That's one point that I want to make, and I do think is very important. And I think that there's a difference between what we are defining as mystical and ultimately what we would consider abstract or metaphysical. And there is value in metaphysics and being able to discuss things that are not necessarily concrete and that emerge and are more holistic and nonetheless are part of human experience. The other thing that I will say is with regard to the question I'm having. It's interesting because I would like to qualify this and hear your thoughts on it and then open up to questions. With regards to thought, I'm not so sure that Judaism is more inclined towards deed than it is towards thought. I think that if we were carefully examining, we know that deeds that are practiced with inappropriate thought or flawed thought or problematic thought are not considered to be deeds at all. Everything goes after the thought. And when our thought is inappropriate or not properly set, the deeds amount to nothing. And the Rambam writes this very explicitly in several places. He writes it very explicitly in several places. The fact that there's a discussion of, for example, do mitzvot need kavanah or not need kavanah, is only a question of how much I have to be paying attention to the mitzvah that I'm doing at the time that I'm doing it, but not a question of what does the mitzvah or doing a mitzvah mean to me in general with regards to my relationship to God. And so that's important. The Rambam goes so far as to say that if my mindset is not in a place that we call teshuvah, when I do a mitzvah, they rip the mitzvot up in my face, which we will leave.
The Rambam
Sorry?
The Rambam really was an extreme in the role that he gave to thought.
That might be,
yeah.
But he didn't write it outside of Divrei Chazal. So the question of deeds happening, and it is very rational, because when we recognize that the framework for my actions is what defines the nature of my actions, which is the way that it works throughout the world. There is no such thing as inherent value in a detail. All details only maintain value based on the context within which they are performed. The Torah itself is given in very specific terms. Kadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe, before you give the Torah, this is what you need to say, Bnei Israel. Say this, make sure that this is what you say. It says it over and over again, in the psukim. And this is the preamble to the mitzvot of the Torah. And what does God say? Remember, I took you out of Egypt on the wings of eagles. You'll be for me a people. I will be for you a God. These are my statutes. And if you engage in them in any other fashion, then we've got problems. And this is why God ends up accusing Israel of being harlots. It's what we read before Tisha B'Av. How is it that the love became prostitution? Well, it's the same act. I mean, I'm just doing the same thing, and the korbanot that you asked me to do, I'm doing. They're all being performed. Yeah, but befivu bisfatav kibiduni v'libor achat mimenu. Yeah, you're giving me lip service, but your heart is nowhere to be found. And your heart is all about in terms of what it is that the mitzvot are doing and the idea of Rachamana Liba Ba'eh, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants a heart. So those are very serious things that we have to be careful not to disregard and act in terms of mechanics. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not interested in mechanics. So those are 2 points that I think are important to make. If you want to respond, you want to respond?
Let's open the floor to questions.
We'll open the floor to questions.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll open the floor to questions. Jonathan. Why don't we see if we can, I don't know how far I can take this, but I don't know if I can do it for everybody. Yeah, there we go. Don't take down the speakers.
So you refer to yourself as a die-hard rationalist. Is that in the context of comparing yourself to a mystic, or do you not think that if an atheist scientist was sitting here, he could refer to you as a mystic and him as a rational, and at the source do you not have faith that you're then rationalising, which could be viewed as irrational?
Got any other questions then? Okay. I think I have to answer this. There's obviously, I believe that faith can, at least to some extent, be grounded in rational thought. Perhaps not in all aspects. With certain atheists, I would disagree with their views in terms of whether it's really rational. The fact is, when you have a universe that's as incredible as ours, it demands explanation. So it's a very special universe that we have. So you could say, well, maybe there's an infinite number of universes, and then ours is not so special. Okay, maybe, but there's not necessarily any evidence for that either. So I don't necessarily think that it's not necessarily irrational to believe in God and so on. However, yes, there's certain things. I'm not as die-hard a rationalist as all that. As I've written in my blog, there's some things where I do. At least personally, what can I say? It's interesting. You look at the Rishonim and what they have to say about Hashgacha, about providence, and they have a very, very, very limited view of providence. Whereas personally in my own life, I can't help it. I feel a tremendous amount of providence. When I was a little kid, I said I want to have a zoo when I grow up, and everyone laughed at me. Nice Jewish boys don't have zoos, and lo and behold, I have a zoo. So perhaps I'm not as die-hard rationalist as all that. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, you can choose it. You choose the people. You choose the people.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Stand up if you don't mind speaking.
Two questions, two short questions. First of all, you mentioned you lumped together Rav Hirsch with Rambam as being rationalist. In the 19 letters of Hirsch.
Very harsh views of Rambam, right?
If you could just qualify what that is, what Rav Hirsch has a problem with the Rambam and how the rationalism is in place.
Yeah.
My other question is, sort of links into the question that guy over there asked. You described your rationalism in nature as not believing that miracles happen all the time, but there is a structure of nature. But since you still believe that miracles can happen, you surely still believe in a magical wizard God. How is that rational?
Okay, so let's deal with the first question first. Yes, Rav Hirsch had some extremely harsh criticisms of Rambam as being too accepting of Greek philosophy and so on, which, yes, Rambam was certainly did accept a lot of things from the outside, some of which are very hard to square with traditional Judaism. However, with regard to these aspects, Rav Hirsch were largely on the same page. And in Rav Hirsch's letters, when he deals with Torah science questions, he explicitly refers to Rambam's approach as being the precedent in that area. So yes, Rav Hirsch was very critical of Rambam in some areas, but not, I see it, in this area. The second thing of miracles, so firstly I should elaborate again, something perhaps I wasn't clear enough about. When we talk about the rationalist approach, the mystical approach, even within those it's a spectrum. Right? You have Rambam and Ralbag and Meiri, and they don't always see eye to eye and everything. Right? And then even within Rambam, what exactly was Rambam's view? So you've got 800 years of scholarship, and ferocious disputes as to what Rambam actually held. Did he just minimize miracles? Did he say that there's never any miracles? What was his view on providence? So a tremendous range of disputes. But to be honest, I want to clarify what you're saying. There's a difference between, firstly, rational and rationalist. Right? There's nothing particularly more or less rational about saying God works through miracles or God works through nature. There's nothing to do with rational or not. Rather, it's a particular worldview which I've called rationalist. Right? There's nothing irrational about saying that God works through miracles. Right? It's just, it might be irrational to believe in a specific claim about, this rabbi did this miracle, well, I don't believe it. Right? But there's nothing per se irrational about saying that God works through miracles. Right? So I was using the word rationalist, not rational, to reflect that it's a different worldview. Okay.
You had a question.
Both of you are on record as being quite happy to stand up and oppose mystical charlatans. And I wonder if you could speak a little about what you think makes other rabbis less happy to speak about such things in public, whilst they are happy to speak about them privately.
How about you?
You want to should I start with that one? He wants me to go down tonight. No. Look, I mean, it's hard to be able to speak for everybody who's not us, you know. But in my experience, I would say one of two things. A, it's possible that given the circumstances that a particular rabbi or scholar might be in, they are concerned about the backlash and the ramifications of what it is that they will say. And they don't want, like a Magen David burned on their lawn, or, a Malakov cocktail, thrown in. It could happen. It really could, believe me. There's violence. So that's one thing. And the other is that it is very, look, Rabbi Slifkin has researched and studied the depths of these issues. He when he writes, as he said, he's bringing out the words of Hachamim of many generations that have written this. Unfortunately, that level of scholarship in these issues is rarer than one might think. And so while one might feel as though certain things that are said are not necessarily appropriate, or they don't hold water, and so on and so forth, not as often are they able to give arguments and support them appropriately, and that's a problem with the system. If you've studied to become a rabbi, you spend time studying Talmud, a lot of time studying Talmud, which is unfortunate, quite frankly. It's very unfortunate, because when the Talmud is not taught in ways that it itself ends up becoming practical, we lose time in terms of our study. And that goes back to the mystical question. Maybe it's just reading the Talmud itself, is enough. I mentioned in a shir last night, there's Hachamim who write about the Zohar. All you have to do is read the Zohar. And it's much better than any other study that you'll ever do. And you don't even have to read it correctly. Just read, and it's fine. So when you spend all of your time studying Talmud, and you don't then question what are the distilled elements that I get from the study of the Talmud, and most importantly, with regard to these issues, the Agadic elements of the Talmud, not the Halachic elements of the Talmud, the Agadic elements being the poetic, story-like parables that are brought out in the Talmud. What on earth are the Hachamim trying to tell me over here? You're not equipped to answer the questions appropriately. And so I say it's one of two things. Either A, that we're concerned about what my words will cause, what kind of backlash my words will cause, or B, we tend not to be as able to respond as some people might think, in certain situations, or a mixture of the two. That's how I see it. Yeah.
I agree.
Oh. Yes.
Well, I'm the type of Jewish woman who believe very much that everything that happens is from God.
Okay.
For example, if I break a plate at home or something similar, I will think, just as well, because my grandson would have had an accident, so now I broke a plate and that instead, okay? At the same time, I never believed in the Shiluach Hakan. I always thought that it's just I never wear a ribbon. So am I a mystical woman?
You got the best of both worlds. I'm not, like I said, I'm not on a campaign to.
The main question which I really want an answer to is: do we believe that everything that happens to us happens from Agadata?
Who's we?
You
say, do we believe?
Judaism.
Right, but Judaism, I once saw this magazine. Where was I? Some other country. I saw this magazine, a Jewish magazine, and it had a column, and what does Judaism say about? And there's no such question, because there's no single voice within Judaism. The particular magazine I saw was, what does Judaism say about magic? Well, which Judaism? The Judaism of Rambam, who completely denied magic, or the Judaism of Ramban, who said, yes, there is magic, but it's forbidden? So these things, what you say, you're talking about providence and so on. There's a whole spectrum of different views. There's no such thing as what does Judaism believe. There's all different views.
I would just say one thing to that. When you say everything comes from God, you're not really saying that. What you're saying is everything comes. No. But let's be clear on what you're saying. It's important to define your words. When you say everything comes from God, you can be meaning one of two things. You can either say that there is no other source for things to happen, right? God's the only source. And there is a Gemara in Chulin Daf Chet, which says not a person doesn't move their finger without God saying that he should move his finger. Yeah, and people bring this to me all the time when I say God does not make us move our finger. And they bring me the Talmud. And what I say to them is, you haven't read the rest of the page. Because the rest of the page talks about witchcraft. And these things coming from other sources. And what the Talmud is saying in that statement is, nothing happens in this world that doesn't originate from its ultimate source, which is God. So if that's what you're saying, there's nobody, I don't think anybody in religion, in Jewish religion, that would dispute that. But if you're saying, therefore, God controls directly every specific detailed act, that is up for major discussion in Judaism. And the Rambam would say, absolutely not, that's not true. Right? Somebody like the Rambam would say, it's absolutely not true. And others might say that it is, but we also, when we believe these kinds of things, have to question the implications. What does that mean about my free will? What does it mean about the openness for me to be able to make differences in my life, to do teshuvah, and so on and so forth? So those are things that we have to think about when we make those kinds of statements.
Rabbi Dweck, how we keep talking about about God, this entity. How do you define God? Because I think we need to work with defining definitions.
Yes. Nobody's going anywhere, right? Look, it's to be fair to God, right? Not an answer that we can give in the amount of time that everybody's prepared to sit here in our social contract. I will say this very shortly, all right? The Rambam basically opens it up in very simple terms, and he talks about primal existence, that which existed before all things existed. But Ramchal does the same thing when he opens up his Derech Hashem. So primal existence is one thing, right? The ultimate source for all things, what we would call existence itself with a capital E. That's one element that we have to know about God. The question is, how does that play into our lives? And that's a much more developed discussion, right? And that's really where all of the argument ultimately comes from, and what we're questioning over here. So,
if I can just add a little bit to that. Again, it's similar to the previous question. I say, how do we define God? Who's we? Rambam defined God very differently to say how the Tosafists defined God. Rambam says it's heretical to believe that God has any kind of physical form, right. And Rav Moshe Taku, one of the Tosafists, says that that's heretical. That's heretical to deny the possibility that God can take on physical form if he wants to.
He was wrong, but
that's
the difference between me and Rabbi.
Yeah. There's different views.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
With Shiluach Hakan, it's quite nice and easy to give a rationalist approach to why that is a mitzvah, because it's almost humanist to not hurt a bird. Mm-hmm. But there are other mitzvot in the Torah which are less easy to explain.
Absolutely, yeah.
They're a lot easier to explain 3,500 years ago, where it was okay to be a homophobic, misogynist slave owner. But now, you can't really... It's very hard to understand how they would make society a better place, make people better people, make the general experience for most people better. And taking the rationalist approach, how can we explain them? And if we can't explain them, does it not call their validity into question and call the document into question?
The rationalist approach does not maintain that every person can understand exactly the function of the mitzvah. Right? It's just that the mitzvahs do have a function. Now, it might take some more work. You might have to really study the history and look at what was going on in the world at that time. Rambam contextualizes many of the mitzvahs and saying that to really understand them, some of these, the chukim, also some of these harder ones, you have to look at what was going on in the world, what other nations were doing, and realize that the Torah was trying to gradually break people away from that, which is a very controversial view in some circles, understandably. But that's what he said. He said, basically what Rambam is saying is that you cannot even understand the function of the mitzvah unless you really understand what the Torah was competing with at the time, which many of us now, it's been lost in history. We're never going to understand it.
But then is the Torah and all the mitzvot timeless if they are
So,
intended specifically to?
Right, so there's a great book you should read, a biography of Rambam by Dov Halbertal. He discusses this point very well, and he says yes, because once a mitzvah has been legislated, its authority is permanent. Even if the particular contextual reason has been lost, but it doesn't matter, it's been enacted, it has authority. And again, we're working from a presumption that you accept that you're part of the halachic community, which obeys mitzvahs being commanded by God. And it would not be rational to say, well, I personally don't understand the reason for that mitzvah, so I'm not going to keep it. What do you mean? You're part of the halachic community that's accepted a covenant with God. It doesn't depend on whether you as an individual agree with the reason for a particular mitzvah.
Would you say that in the end, faith is a feeling rather than a thought or a thinking process? Like love?
I don't know. I don't know. Too abstract a question for me to be able to answer.
Faith, you call faith.
I'm Mancunian, I'm very down to earth, I don't speak in
faith is a word.
I will say that emunah is usually, the real traditional meaning of emunah, faith, is more faith in than faith that. It's loyalty to, not belief that. The traditional emunah, if you look at the etymology of the word, it's not about having a certain abstract, maintaining a certain set of abstract dogmas, but rather it's a commitment, it's a loyalty. So I'd say yes, probably more on the more towards the feeling side, yeah.
So if it's a feeling, each person has his own way to feel.
Well, that's what I said. Different strokes for different folks.
Last question, sir.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, you spoke, Rabbi Slifkin, a little bit about the practical ramifications of some of these conceptual disagreements. For example, when you talk about kazait, you said that different people will define a kazait as different amounts. I'm just wondering, when we get down to it, when you have to actually decide what to do, you spoke just now about the idea of a halachic community. So when we're looking at halakha, we're not looking at individuals, we're looking at a community of people. So the halachic community seems to have decided that a kazait is some large amount, much greater than olive.
Right.
Do we then need to eat that much matzah?
Right.
Matzah on Pesach? Do we then, when deciding how much food a sick person can eat on Yom Kippur?
Okay, excellent question. Right. Well, you know what the technical term is for a person who eats, this gigantic chazanish-sized share of matzah is? He's a masochist. But no, seriously, folks. You raise a very important bit. Firstly, with the kazait, I always speak that there can be other considerations involved. The classic case, by the way, is I mentioned how the Gemara, as everyone in antiquity, shared this mistaken belief in spontaneous generation. Right, that certain creatures come into existence not from parent creatures, but spontaneously from dust and so on. And the Gemara makes a halacha based on it. Right? The Gemara, normally you're not allowed to kill animals in Shabbos, but the Gemara says you can kill lice. Why can you kill lice? Because they spontaneously generate, so they're not real life forms. Now nowadays we know that it's not true. The lice don't spontaneously generate, they're born from little bitty eggs. So does that mean that now you're not allowed to kill lice in Shabbos? So Rav Hirsch and many others say no, that the heta given, the permission given by the Gemara still holds true. Why? Because it's about the authority of Chazal. Right? Partly being a part of the halachic community means that we accept the authority of the Gemara. Just like the Gemara accepted the authority of the Mishnah, doesn't always agree with everything they said in the Mishnah, but they canonized it, accepted its authority. So post the Gemara, we accept the authority of the Gemara. So there can be all kinds of other considerations in regard to halacha, and one of those considerations is what community you're a part of. But there are different communities within Judaism. Right? I don't wear tchelet. Right? I'm convinced that tchelet is indeed from the Murex trunculus. Tchelet, blue strings on the tzitzit, and there's debate about what does it really come from. And I'm convinced that it really is the one that they market under the label tchelet, a certain type of snail called the Murex trunculus. But I don't wear it. I'm not saying it's wrong to wear it, but I don't. Why? Because I feel as though I'm already pushing the envelope pretty far. And and I feel that certainly if I'm pushing things ideologically, so when it comes to the practical halachic sphere, I want to be very conservative with the small c. But there's plenty of communities where in this community it's perfectly normative to wear tchelet. Right, so when it comes to matzah, so if you're part of a community where everyone is eating, large quantities of matzah, then perhaps it's not a good idea to start undermining those treasured values. I've heard stories of people who read my kazait essay, and then there were huge fights, at the Seder. About how much to eat, which is really not what Pesach is about. It's family time, not fight night. Same thing. Oh, you're a cynic. The British, so cynical. So again, I think a person does have to be sensitive to what community they're in.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
So I've got a couple of books available over there.
Yes.
If you want to buy them.
Rabbi, I highly recommend everyone. The Rabbi Slifkin's books at the table. Do yourself a favor. Take 1, 2, all. Spend some time reading. Open yourself to some beautiful insights in Torah. He has also, like he was mentioning, there's the zoo, the biblical zoo.
No, it's not us. Biblical Zoo in the Jews. We are a Biblical Museum of Natural History.
Biblical Museum of Natural History. Mechila. Biblical
In Bet
Museum of
Shemesh.
Natural History. In Bet Shemesh. Do yourself a favor and please go visit. And thank you, Arav.
Thank
for a
you
beautiful
very much.
music.